I mean, the level of government interference that became normalised in COVID was shocking. As I was growing up, I saw the transformation of Docklands transformed through creating a lower regulatory environment and a lower tax environment.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs. My name's Tom Clougherty. I'm the Executive Director here. And for the next hour, I will be in conversation with our special guest this evening, James Cleverly. James is the Member of Parliament for Braintree. He's the Shadow Home Secretary, and he's a Lieutenant Colonel in the Army Reserve. He is, of course, one of 4 remaining candidates to be the next leader of the Conservative Party. Before politics, James worked in publishing. He was elected to the London Assembly in 2008. He entered Parliament in 2015. He supported Brexit in the 2016 referendum, and he went on to serve as chairman of the Conservative Party, as Education Secretary, as Foreign Secretary, and most recently as Home Secretary. James, welcome, or perhaps I should say welcome back to the IEA. We're very happy to have you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and it's lovely, as you say, it's lovely to come back. I've spent more than a few evenings talking free market economics over a glass of wine in this room.
Excellent. Well, hopefully many more to come as well. I'll start with a very general question. I mean, the point of this interview, and I should say, of course, the IEA is not endorsing any candidate. We're a non-political think tank and we have invited everybody. We're delighted that you're the first one to come in and speak to us. But the real point of these conversations is to give you a chance to talk in a little bit more detail about your economic views, the kind of conversations that often get crowded out in general political debate. So a very open question to start with, James. How would you describe your economic views? Where do you think they put you in today's Conservative Party and indeed in politics as a whole right now?
Well, Tom, I've always viewed myself as a Thatcherite. And I said that when I was first being selected on the London Assembly. I said that when I first ran for local council in Lewisham. And I say that still. And the reason for that is because she and the philosophy that she fronted up, it was the defining backdrop to the young part of my life. So I was born in 1969. Everyone's meant to be shocked and surprised that I was born in 1969. Thank you. So I was born in 1969. So I didn't necessarily understand what was happening at the time, but I could see that it was pretty rubbish as going into the back end of the 1970s with strikes and power cuts and bins, piling up, bin bags piling up on the street. So I could tell it wasn't good. And then Margaret Thatcher came along, and obviously she was heavily influenced by a load of other thinkers, Keith Joseph and Milton Friedman and various others. But she was transformational, and you cannot help but absorb that. And for me, seeing the change from the late 1970s through to the 1980s, both in our families' fortunes and the country and the capitalist democracies like ours in the US, you cannot help but have that become one of your biggest influences. And so she is and remains one of my main inspirations, and the ideas she put forward about us being internationally minded, free market, capitalists, mass ownership of shares and property, etc., is still very much in my head and heart.
Yeah. And so in your leadership launch speech, I think it was, you identified a crisis of confidence in capitalism as one of the 3 greatest challenges that we face. First of all, what do you mean by that? But secondly, you referenced Thatcher and her transformational economic leadership. Does this crisis of confidence in capitalism require that same kind of transformational economic leadership again? Or is this a very different situation?
So it's not the same as then. And it would be wrong and lazy for us to assume that the kind of solutions that she applied in the early 80s and the mid 80s are the same as what needs to happen now. But at the more fundamental level, there are definitely echoes of that time. So she became party leader when managed decline was the universally agreed philosophy, that our best years were in the past rather than in the future, that the large state was the right answer to all of the world's ills. And she confronted, and that was subscribed to right across the political spectrum. And she basically said, no, there is a fundamentally different and better way of looking at these problems and addressing these challenges. And rather than this constant creeping expansion of the state, reaching out into every part of people's lives, into salaries and prices and nationalised industries, etc., 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 she said, no, the way that we advance as a nation, the way that we stand tall on the world stage, is by deregulating and reducing taxes and liberating individuals and giving them the opportunity to own a stake in the wealth and productivity of this nation. And that is how we fundamentally change the circumstances that we inherit. Now, we've slipped out of our habit, and we got a slap at the last general election, and we have a choice. We do one of two things. We either maintain the status quo ante, or we say the British people have told us they want us to be different, so let's be different, and use that as the jumping off point to get back into government.
Sam, I want this conversation mostly to focus on your ideas for the future.
Sure.
But I think we probably can't ignore the fact that the Conservatives were in government for 14 years. And so this crisis of confidence in capitalism has come about on their watch.
Sure.
Maybe that's one of the big differences from when Thatcher became party leader in the mid-70s. If you reflect back over the last years, whether it's just back to 2015 when you entered Parliament or beyond, in terms of economic policy making, where do you think things went wrong? I mean, do you think things went wrong?
Well, so the voters are never wrong, and the voters kicked us out of office rather unceremoniously. So clearly things went wrong. There's no point in pretending otherwise. And I can't remember the last time we really made the case for kind of liberal free markets as Conservatives. I can't really remember the last time when we energetically made the case for capitalism. I think that what we assumed was that people got it. They understood our philosophy. They understood our thinking, that they just took it as read. And we stopped selling it to the British people, and we stopped selling it to ourselves. And so in the armed forces, in the military, where I have some experience on Tuesday nights and weekends, is that is you are required to regularly restate the mission. And that's how you avoid mission creep and drift. And I can't remember the last time we restated to ourselves our philosophical mission. And then unsurprisingly, you look back at our recent past, we keep doing all these things that don't support free markets, that support incumbent providers rather than new entrants to the market, that regulate in such a way as we deny choice to consumers. And then we wonder why prices go up and the quality of service diminishes. We disincentivize, no, that's not quite fair. We didn't incentivize anywhere near enough entrepreneurialism and risk-taking. We created an environment where we valued the plucky underdog that failed. And I started a business and it went under. Okay, I got more love as my business was dying than I did when it was launched. Yeah, everyone seems to love the hardworking person that doesn't succeed, and that's wrong. We should, of course, be sympathetic to people in that circumstance. But what we should really do is massively value the people who took a risk and were successful, who became wealthy and employed other people and created that ripple effect that you get around successful enterprises where the suppliers get wealthier and their suppliers get wealthier, etc., etc. And we completely slipped out of the habit of doing that. And as I say, the voters are never wrong. And the British people said, look, if you're not going to be Tories, then I'll have the blooming Labour government.
Yeah.
I think they're regretting it. We discussed before we came on stage. The honeymoon period, if it existed at all, has become very short. But we can't just wait for the pendulum to swing back in our direction, because it might not. We need to go out and get it.
I'm really struck by something you said there, actually, about, first of all, making the case for free economy to the public, but also first making it among yourselves and sort of restating the mission and, I suppose, trying to orient your political party around a core set of beliefs which kind of embrace free market capitalism. There's the famous story, whether it's true or not, I'm not sure, about Margaret Thatcher with Hayek's Constitution of Liberty and banging it on the table and saying, this is what we believe. Would there be a hint of that in James Cleverly's leadership? Not that book necessarily.
Well, look, you got to start with a belief set. You got to start with a philosophy, and then individual policies grow from that fertile soil. And as I say, I mean, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. We know what works, and periodically we make it work. So I grew up in southeast London, and when I went for a walk to Greenwich Park, I could look over the Thames, and as I was growing up, I saw the transformation of Docklands, transformed through creating a lower regulatory environment and a lower tax environment. And what we saw, those incentives really boosted that formerly neglected part of London. I saw the same thing happening when I was in City Hall in London. You said I was on the London Assembly. I was on the London Development Agency when we unlocked the potential of the Olympic Park. Again, lower tax, less regulation. Go off on Teesside, Ben Houchin, again, using a tried and tested formula, less red tape, lower taxes, attractive with investment, unlock the potential of a community. So we know what works. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we do need to remind ourselves and then the British people that, this is the way to do it. And rather than tax and regulate, and then tax and regulate and subsidise, and then tax, regulate and subsidise a bit more, which we know doesn't work because the British voters have just told us the last general election they're not happy with that. Why don't we, just on the off chance that it might work once again, do what's worked in the past?
So there's a quote I'll read back to you. I think, again, this was from your leadership launch speech. And you said, I will make boosting our economic growth the defining mission, and I will make selling the benefits of free markets to a new generation a key part of that. So I'd like to touch on both of those aspects. And I think you've partially answered the first half of that already. But in concrete terms, and I know you're running to be leader of the opposition first, and Prime Minister perhaps second. But if you found yourself in government and your mission, the defining mission of your government is to boost economic growth, and by the way, I agree. I mean, that should be at the forefront of every government's thinking, that it isn't, given the other challenges we face that would become so much easier to deal with if we got growth back up just where it was before the financial crisis. It's strange that this gets relegated to a second or third level concern. But if that's your defining mission and you find yourself in Downing Street, where do you start? What do you prioritise?
Well, I think Napoleon described us as a nation of shopkeepers?
Right.
So we are a small business nation. We are disproportionately a service sector economy. And if you're going to unlock the economic potential of a bit of the system, let's go with the bit of the system that is most prevalent in our society, in our economy. So taking the burden of regulation off of small businesses, I think, is a no-regrets course of action, irrespective of what sector they're in, for a number of reasons. Firstly, because most people in the UK are employed in small businesses. Most private sector employees are employed in small businesses. Point one. Point two, if you want to create a more dynamic, more competitive market, small and growing businesses are where it's at. Because you and I both know that despite their rhetoric, perhaps even despite their best intentions, when you get a big and established business, the first thing they do is start lobbying for regulation to protect. This is why the EU, this is why I wanted to get out of the EU, because the EU is a focal point for big business lobbyists to put up regulatory barriers to new entrants. And so if we make it easier and better for small businesses to compete with incumbent suppliers, to compete with bigger businesses, to snap at their heels, keep them honest, keep them tight, keep them efficient, then we would have done a huge service both to those businesses and their employees, but to society as a whole. So that's where I would start. And there are a whole load of. I'll give you one example. Which I also mentioned at that launch speech, which does my head in. It really, really does. Childcare. So we have a huge amount of talent and economic potential embedded in women in our country. And we want to give them the opportunity to go back to work should they wish to. But that means childcare. And we have regulated the childcare sector to such an extent that it costs twice what it does in France, 3 times what it does in Germany, if I've got my figures correct, pricing many working women out of the market. So what do? Fork in the road moment. Do we ease the regulatory environment of the nursery sector and allow competition to bring the prices down? No, we do not. What we do is we subsidise the nursery system, and we subsidise it with money that we've collected from taxes, administrated by civil servants, all paid for by more taxes. And who are we taxing? The mums who we're trying to release back into the workplace. It is perverse beyond belief. And yet we've allowed ourselves to drift into this way of working, rather than going back to first principles, saying, right, how do we reduce the government-imposed costs on this particular sector? And there are examples like that all over the place. So that's the kind of thing I'd start on.
All right. So I guess in a sense you're talking about deregulatory barriers to growth. That's where you start. That's where you think the greatest potential for economic liberation is. I suppose a couple of follow-ups from there. Something that struck me about your answer, with Napoleon talking of us as the nation of shopkeepers and so on, your response seemed to embody a desire to understand what we're good at and lean into it. And it does strike me that since the financial crisis, as a country, we've sort of done the opposite of that. We've decided that we didn't really like the things that were generating economic growth before 2008. We'd much rather have a different kind of economy. Does that sort of point of view resonate with you? Do you think we need to decide these are the things that Britain is good at and let's go hell for leather for them?
So I'm always a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of picking winners. But when winners have already presented themselves, don't try and make life harder for them. Right. It's so you don't need to be a futurologist to know what bits of the British economy are doing well. We're really good at tech. We're really good at tech. We're really good at the starting point for tech. But what we don't do is we don't allow that sector to grow in the UK. So I've lost track of the number of really good ideas that started, kitchen table ideas, or postgrad student in the back room of one of our fantastic universities. The kind of ideas that started there, got to a certain scale, and then got snapped up overseas. So it's not about picking winners, because the winners have already presented themselves. Other people are putting what is never a surefire bet, but a pretty safe bet on things that we did very, very well. And I've lost track over the decades of how many examples we have of that. We know that we've got a service sector economy. That's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. So again, why do we time the noose so tightly that we can't liberate those parts of the of the UK economy. We should recognise, as Ben Houchin is doing, and I'm a big fan of it. I won't describe myself as a fanboy, but I'm a big fan of his. I'm a really big fan of his because he took a part of the UK, part of the country that defined itself by a particular industry, by a particular sector. So the steel industry, where he was, I mean, it's defined by that as an industry. And when that went, it lost its self-identity. And what he's done is he is in the process of creating a new identity, using much of the community spirit and that desire for hard work that was embedded in that former industrial part of the UK. And he's doing it off the back of green energy, carbon capture and storage, offshore wind, etc. So he's taking stuff that we are ahead of the pack on, and making it part of the future of that part of the country, and that's what we should do. That's what we should do more of. And what he's not doing is saying no. This is a steel industry part of the country. So if it ain't steel industry, I'm not interested. Yeah. So he's looking forward. He's looking at the future rather than being nostalgic about the past. If we do that, we're on the route to success. Mm-hmm. If we're backward looking, we're stuffed.
Yeah. So you suggested one of the reasons you supported Brexit was concerns about kind of Brussels regulation, its capture by big corporations trying to crowd out competition and so on. I mean, what would be your assessment of how well we've moved on from that post-Brexit? I know the wry smile immediately crossed your face there, so I can kind of guess the beginning of your answer. But you were in Whitehall, you were in Parliament. Why was more progress not made to kind of decouple Britain from those European regulatory structures?
Look, I think that habit is more deeply ingrained than any of us would like to admit. Mm. I'm also conscious that at a point when we could and should have really been changing the way we did things, we had a couple of once-in-a-lifetime events that happened one after another. COVID and then Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, which knocked everybody, us included, sideways. And when you're unsettled, as the world was, you clutch onto, you reach out for the most familiar point of stability, which I think in the UK was how we had done things before we left the European Union. So I think that's why we didn't move as far or as fast as we should have done.
Do you think it would have been very different had the pandemic not intervened?
Look, that sliding door kind of answer. It's impossible to tell, but we ended up doing, we became a much bigger state. I mean, the level of government interference that became normalised in COVID was shocking. I mean, Boris Johnson, a naturally libertarian, I mean, if politics is divided up into kind of roundheads and cavaliers, he was very, very much at the kind of the long curly hair end of the spectrum. But he cancelled Christmas. Him, and the reason I'm talking cavaliers and roundheads, are him and Oliver Cromwell. The two people that cancelled Christmas, and he didn't do it, for fun, but that was part of it. So who can tell? But more broadly, one of the things that I said would be a byproduct of us leaving the European Union, which I think is playing out, maybe not quite as quickly as I would have hoped or expected, but it is definitely playing out, is an excuse is stripped away from us. And the number of times civil servants would say to ministers, well, of course, we can't do that because of our membership of the European Union. Yeah. Now that we've left the European Union, there is no There is no scapegoat. There is no excuse. We choose to do it or we choose not to do it. But the choice is ours. And the response from the electorate cannot be offloaded onto anyone else. And we just got a big slap at the general election because we failed to deliver adequately on the promise embedded in our departure from the European Union. And so let's not do that again. Let's make sure that when we next present ourselves to the electorate, we are taking full advantage of both the freedom and also ultimately the responsibility that comes with our departure from the EU.
Yeah. So let's talk about selling the benefits of free markets to a new generation. It's obviously something we're very much about at the IEA as well. For you, politically, is this largely about housing, or is it a much broader thing than that?
It is broader than that, but housing is a really key starting point. From Macmillan through Margaret Thatcher, we have learned as Conservatives that when we get the housing offer right, we are rewarded at the ballot box. So it is the right thing to do because it's the right thing to do. It's also a politically pragmatic thing to do. And when those two things converge, why wouldn't you want to pursue that as a policy area? And the bottom line is, you talk to people under the age of 40, and a credible chance on a credible chance of getting themselves on the housing ladder is almost the default conversation, and it's not. And it's no longer just in London and the South East. There was a time when this was exclusively a London problem. That is not the case anymore. And if we can't convince a new generation of voters that we can address one of their key concerns, their ability to get on the housing ladder, they won't even listen to us about any of the other things they might be worried about. So it is not sufficient, but it is necessary. Which is why in my launch speech, I spoke about freeing up the housing market, about giving people a credible opportunity to get on the housing ladder. Because if we get that right, we've got a foot in the door. We can have other conversations. We get that wrong, we're out of government indefinitely, maybe even permanently.
I'm really interested in the sort of the dynamics of that political debate over the next 5 years because, the Labour government says they want the same things that you do on housing.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
Well, they would, but they're in government and they're announcing things. I suppose that what I mean by the political dynamics of this debate is surely there is every incentive for the Conservative Party to be cynical and short-termist about this and just chase the NIMBY vote and try and attack Labour on their plans and try and win popularity that way. Is that something you feel comfortable that you have a compelling message that you can resist and you can say, no, actually, we want more housing. We want to get rid of stamp duty is one of the things that you've raised as well.
So Conservatives we've been at our best when we've been at our boldest. And we've been at our boldest when we have been willing not to confront the kind of established power bases, but have been willing to not allow them to dictate to us. So you look at the City of London pre the deregulation, pre-Big Bang. It was very, very much established boys' club. Very much Tory.
Yeah.
And yet Margaret Thatcher came along and said, no. I know you're the sons, not daughters. You are the sons of, the establishment. You went to the right schools. You all know each other. But I'm going to get a whole load of, boys and girls from the East End to come snapping at your heels. I'm going to break down your fortress. I'm going to introduce a whole load of competition into your sector, your market. Not popular with the financial services establishment. Transformational transformational. You can go back through our history, even now Corn Laws. If you want to go back even that far, and when we confront the establishment in order to deliver for the whole, then we are rewarded. Now, at the moment, we have a situation where, just like under Margaret Thatcher, you've got one group of people who have property assets which are accumulating in value, and then you have another group of people whose noses are kind of squashed up against the window, looking enviously at the people who have. And actually, one of the wonderful opportunities that we have now is that we've got a whole load of people with asset wealth, but not liquid wealth, who could and should liquidate their assets in part, downsize, which would benefit them, give them liquidity that they could utilise, and benefit the people who are currently excluded from the property market. And it's as close to everyone's a winner as you can possibly get. And that's what we should look to do. The house that I grew up in, my next door neighbours, their children moved out 35 years ago. It's an old couple in a 5-bedroom house. There are 3 unutilised bedrooms in a family home, and that has been the case for 35 years in a city that has a housing shortage. And that is replicated in 100 locations, 5 minutes walk from the house that I grew up in. So if we could increase liquidity, if we could remove the disincentive of them downsizing and unlocking that family house for a family that's currently squashed in a house that's too small, get this wonderful domino effect, which frees up a starter home for someone who is currently renting and is desperately trying to get on the house ownership ladder. That's why I'm saying we should scrap stamp duty, because it prevents the couple in the house next to the one I grew up in from downsizing, while simultaneously preventing a young couple getting on the housing market. It's a completely perverse tax.
And I think one of the interesting things about downsizing, obviously you don't want to force anybody out of their homes if they want to stay there and have the extra bedrooms.
But I also don't want to force them to stay put, because they're going to get beaten up with tax.
And I think one of the things I see in America, and I lived in America for a number of years, is that you have sort of kind of huge boom in building very nice housing for the over 55s. Now, part of this is because many parts of America have messed up school funding systems. So they won't allow new properties to be built that might be inhabited by children because they don't want to build more school places and so on. So this is bad. But one of the consequences is you get a lot of housing built specifically for the over 55s. And this is not kind of dreary retirement housing. These are quite desirable developments to live in. And as a consequence, I think of my wife's friends, almost all of their parents, almost down to the last one, have very happily downsized, moved somewhere smaller that's more suitable for them in older age, maybe got a holiday home somewhere as well. But I think the reason they've been able to do that is because there is this elastic supply of housing, that stuff is being built for their needs in a way that it's so difficult to get it done in Britain. I suppose actually because local councils, the last thing local councils want in Britain is more old people, because they're stuck with the social care bills at the moment. So perverse incentives abound in housing, I suppose. One quick follow-up on this housing question before we move on. There were obviously very ambitious reforms mooted in 2020. And I can remember being on an IA broadcast during the pandemic and talking about, hopes and fears for the government, and saying, well, if they do nothing else, they're definitely going to reform the planning system. And that'll make it all worthwhile. Now, it didn't happen. Do you have, what's your theory on why that fell apart and how it might be overcome next time?
Well, look, it's difficult. Reforming the planning process is difficult, and it touches upon the risk of making yourself unpopular with a group of people who you believe are your core voters. But I do think there's an opportunity of getting it right, and you've got to make a compelling message, because a lot of our core voters have got children, they've got grandchildren. They can see the problem that we have here. And also one of the other big things is pitch rolling. And you've got to make the case. This is an opportunity forced upon us. It's an undesirable opportunity that's forced upon us because we're now in opposition. And when you're in opposition, you don't get to do very much, but you do get to talk about stuff. So we should take this opportunity now. This is why I'm saying reselling conservative values to a new generation. Because now, whilst the Labour Party is screwing up, as I was about to say, as they inevitably will, I mean, they're doing already. They haven't wasted any time to screw things up. So we should waste no time making the case for the alternative, not basically doing the same but with a different colour rosette, but by doing it differently. Because I think now the British people will be willing to listen to credible alternatives. So we better get our act in gear. We better get ourselves ready now, because we need to start making the case now, because the Labour Party is screwing up now.
So, moving on to a different topic, you've been quite blunt, but perhaps even quite brave talking about...
that's always...
Yeah, I know. Courageous, Minister, right? No, about the need to cut public spending.
Okay.
So you've said the state should do fewer things well, not everything badly. And you've said as well, some budgets need to come down in real terms. I couldn't agree more. But where do you start?
So I think the low-hanging fruit, which is both morally right, economically right, and is ripe for change, is the welfare budget. If we were able to get get back to where we were pre-pandemic, that would unlock literally billions of pounds that we're now currently spending in the welfare budget. We've created a whole load of perverse incentives. We've created situations where you can sign people off of work in totality rather than saying, well, what can you do? Let's help you do that. Because we've disincentivized a whole load of areas of work, we've got the corresponding pressure of needing to bring in significant volumes of low-skilled migration to offset the fact there are a number of areas of the British economy which we are told British people are unwilling to work in. Well, I've got a rural constituency. My farmers turn around saying British people don't work in farming. We're here in the West End. You go to a restaurant or you go to a cafe, you talk to the owners there, they say British people don't want to work in service industries, don't want to work in the food and beverage industry. Now, that is untenable. That is untenable. So we need to make sure that people who can work do work. We can't be the sick man of Europe anymore. And that's not just I think there's a moral imperative for doing that, because there is something liberating about earning your own money through work. It defines us. When you meet someone at an event, whether it be at an event like this or a party, what's the two pieces of information you exchange almost first? The first two things: what you're called and what you do. I mean, this is really, really key. It goes to so much more than just our ability to earn money. So there's a moral case, but also there's a really strong economic case. If we don't get Brits back to work, our social model as well as our economic model is broken. So we start there. But there are loads of other things I've already talked about, our intervention in the childcare system. There's a whole load of things that we do where we've crowded out the private sector, and we're taxing people. We're taxing people in order to fuel our addiction for state intervention, and it's unsustainable. It's not a political comment; that is a mathematical comment. It is unsustainable. So we need to do something different. But you can't just dump that on the British people. You have to explain why and how and what the trade-offs are.
Speaking of sustainability, we're not going to go environmental policy. We're going to talk about the ageing population. So you focused there on working age welfare, and I think there's undoubtedly huge strides that could be made there, as you've outlined. Do you think that Conservatives also have to start thinking about the welfare state, the age-related aspects of the welfare state, and their sustainability? I know in your Telegraph column recently, you talked about the OBR's fiscal risks and sustainability report, and they paint a pretty grim picture of public spending rising to 60% of GDP on current policy settings, partly because of debt interest payments, but partly because the population is getting older and the burden of caring for them and providing them with healthcare and everything is increasing as that happens. Now, this is an extremely difficult topic for any politician to comment on or take action on, perhaps especially so for a party that has a relatively older voter base. But are you prepared to entertain radical thoughts? Do you think that we owe it to ourselves almost to kind of think outside the box on some of these issues?
Look, we have to think about how we respond to this. It's not a choice. I mean, it really isn't a choice. If we don't create a more balanced relationship between the younger parts of society and the older parts of society, we will get the demographic equivalent of capital flight. We are already seeing. I talk to people, business people, who are already asking or already talking about leaving the UK because of the decisions the Labour Party is putting in place. If we create an environment where young Britons think that their best future is somewhere else, then the income part of the equation dries up, but the expenditure part of the equation doesn't. And again, it's not policy, it's not even politics, not even economics, it's just maths. It's just maths. And so we need to find ways of rebalancing that. Yeah, one of the things that I think we need to have a look at is about intrafamilial, intergenerational wealth transfer. My dad lives with me, and we're lucky we've got a house that's big enough that he can live with us. And he will live with us until he passes away, just as my mother did. And that will cost us, but my dad has supported me in the past, and I feel that is the right and proper thing to do. It maybe isn't the smartest economic move because of the structures that we put in place, but it feels right for us. Not everyone can do that. I totally get that. Not everyone can do that. But we've created so many disincentives for families to look after each other that they inevitably say, well, it's the state's job to look after my parents as they get older. And maybe this is my African heritage. My African family, they just find that the weirdest concept. So what do you mean the state looks after your mother? Your mother looked after you when you were a child. As your mother gets older, you look after her. That's how this works. And I totally get that not everyone can do it. And we don't want to be in a situation where we're forcing anyone to do anything that they feel isn't right for them. But we also should create a structure where we're not so heavily disincentivizing the most natural human instinct, which is to look after your family, your immediate family, not even your extended family, your immediate family. But we've created now, as I say, such a disincentive to do that inevitably people are saying, well, look, as my parents get old and incontinent, I'm going to hand them across to the state. And it's unsustainable. So we need to start looking at it. I don't pretend that we have all the answers or that I have all the answers, but we need to start looking at what those sustainable solutions would be. Because, as I say, if all we're going to do is keep ramping up the taxes on younger people who aren't on the housing ladder, who got the raw end of the stick during COVID, who feel the state doesn't work for them, and feel political parties are orientating their thinking towards the older generations, they will just go and they will take their money and ideas with them, and then we're in real trouble.
Right, I have two more questions, and then we'll take a handful from the audience as well. So, Some of your competitors in the Conservative leadership race have been quite outspoken about their view that British government is in some sense broken, that the machine doesn't work, that you can't get Whitehall to do the things you want it to do as free marketeers or Conservatives. Is that an analysis you agree with? Or if it isn't, are there nevertheless things that really frustrated you as a government minister and that you'd want to change?
Oh, look. I mean, there's always frustrations in a ministerial relationship with the civil service. I mean, we all joke that that Yes, Prime Minister was not a comedy; it was a training video for the civil service. So look, this is nothing particularly new, but there's no point farmers moaning about the weather. There's no point ministers moaning about the civil service. I've always said, good officers get things in the military. Good officers get things done. Bad officers blame their soldiers. Good ministers get things done. Bad officers blame the civil service. They are not perfect, but they're the only one that we've got. And actually, what I found when I was in ministerial office is if you give clear and unambiguous instructions, if you follow up on those instructions, and if you demand that the most senior officials report into you on the performance of their subordinates, that funnily enough, stuff gets done. So when I was at the Foreign Office and I was rebalancing our foreign policy, as a Brexiteer, let me go into the most pro-Europe institution in government, I got them to focus on emerging markets rather than established markets because I told them and told them again and told them again and held them to account and pushed them. When I went to the Home Office, the Prime Minister sent me in there with a remit to get a grip on migration. And that's what I did. And, I put changes to our visa regime in place, and I negotiated with the Chancellor and the Education Secretary and the Health Secretary, all of whom had a very legitimate but strong interest in our visa regime. You do the hard yards, you cut the deals across Whitehall, you give clear and unambiguous instructions to your officials. And guess what? Visa changes came about. Net migration started coming down, not by the tens of thousands, but by the hundreds of thousands in the, 6-7 months that I was Home Secretary. So the civil service is the civil service. It's far from perfect, but it's the only one we've got. And you got to work with what you've got, not what you wish you had. And this is why I've always said, talking about stuff is easy. Getting stuff done is harder, but we measure our success on what we get done rather than what we talk about we failed to get done. And I've always been in the doers category.
All right, very interesting. Final question. We started this conversation with you describing yourself as a Thatcherite and sort of describing the influence that Margaret Thatcher's government and her radicalism had on your own political awakening, if you like. Nevertheless, I think I've heard you say several times elsewhere, your real political hero is Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
What is it about Ronald Reagan that makes him your political hero, and what would carry over into a James Cleverly leadership?
So the thing that really struck me with Ronald Reagan is, he was a great communicator. And in a sector, in an industry, if you like, that values bright ideas above almost anything else, I think we underplay the importance of inspiring people and infusing people. We talked before we sat down about the Labour government and how badly they've got their first few months in office, how badly wrong they've done almost everything. And I think it's because they assumed that if they did the right things, that would be self-evidently the right thing and they would be rewarded for that. But I don't think they've done the right things, but even if they were doing the right things, their comms strategy has been catastrophic and they are tanking because of it. Ronald Reagan got the fact that if you want to make change, you need to get license from the people that you represent to make that change. If you want them to buy into your ideas, you have to sell your ideas. You don't just blurt them out, you actually persuade people. We are in the persuasion game. And anyone who doesn't recognize that is in the wrong business, because if you get the persuasion bit of the function right, then you get the green light to make the really radical changes that I think we need to make. If you try and make the radical changes without the authority of the people that you serve, they will reject you. So having the best ideas ain't enough. And I think that Ronald Reagan understood that instinctively, and therefore was able, with a sunny demeanour, a really positive, upbeat way of doing politics, was able to not only get elected and then re-elected, but was also able to make really radical change. And the American people were high-fiving him the whole time that he did it. And I think that's where we need to focus. You don't have to be grumpy to be right of centre. And I have no intention of being a grumpy leader. I want to be an optimistic, energetic, positive leader.
There we go. So come 2029 or whenever it is, if all goes according to plan, James Cleverly will be saying it's morning in Great Britain.
Yeah, absolutely.
There we go. All right. Let's have a few questions from the audience then, please. Yeah, gentleman there was very quick.
Thank you. Good evening. You've articulated a view of the Conservative Party which is very Thatcherite. You've said, you yourself have said that, and that is a very neoliberal view. What would you say to your Conservative colleagues and parliamentary colleagues who would argue that neoliberalism is on the way out and that the global conditions for neoliberalism are being challenged? Globalization is being challenged. We're moving more towards a regional world rather than a globalized world of the 90s. What is your response to that challenge to the neoliberal conservative worldview?
Look, one of the challenges that you have in politics when you talk about things being like neoliberal or whatever is that those descriptors that started out as being kind of quite dry and academic increasingly become like loaded and synonymous with particular individuals or particular styles of thinking. And so I try as a personal discipline not to allow myself to be sucked too much into, a tightly defined school of thought like that. But on your broad point, just because something might be unfashionable doesn't mean that it's wrong. And the fact is that we are and have always been at our best and our strongest when we've been globally connected, when we have thought well beyond our kind of our geographical near neighbours, and also when we thought beyond our philosophical near neighbours. So we've got to recognise, and this is one of the things I pushed when I was at the Foreign Office, we've got to recognise that the power players in the kind of the near horizon are not France and Germany and the US and Canada and Japan and Italy, our kind of G7 friends. It's Saudi and the UAE and India and Indonesia and Nigeria and Kenya and there's one of two things that we can do about that realization. We can either start plugging into those relationships now, and again, one of the things I pushed when I was Foreign Secretary, or we can wrap ourselves up in the Euro-Atlantic comfort blanket and just say, oh, actually, you know what, it's kind of regional power blocks that are the really important thing. But I think that would be reassuring and comforting and wrong. So fashionable or unfashionable, the UK is a global player. And there is an expectation of us being a global player, both by the UK domestic audience and our friends around the world. So let's do that thing. And I think there's safety in doing that, because we've got a whole load of really strong pre-existing global relationships that many other countries would bite your hand off to have, and we should make the most of those.
Hey, we have the microphone, second row, stage left.
Firstly, thanks a lot for being with us today. And I wanted to ask you, as you mentioned, the UK economy is heavily reliant on London's financial services industry. London's capital markets have been in decline since 2016, and arguably are in a state of crisis at the minute to an extent. What policy solutions do you suggest to bolster the capital markets and really return the City of London as the undeniable number 2 in the global financial markets after New York?
How about number 1?
I was about to say, yeah. So you know what? So the future that I want to see is that the City and Canary Wharf are vying with each other to be number 1 and number 2 respectively. That should be our aspiration. And we should recognise we still have many of the advantages that we've always had. So we've got the right language, we've got the right time zone. And actually both of those because we started invading people before anyone else, but we'll move on from that. But the point is we've got the international default language, which will be more important in the future rather than less important in the future. And we do straddle global time zones. And we, of course, have first mover advantage. I'm going to impose a discipline on myself because I'm not going to try and guess what a policy platform would look like in 2 to 3 to 4 years' time around our financial services sector. But we've got to make the case once again, and this is a reoccurring theme in my thinking, is that a whole load of people think tighter regulation, more regulation and tighter regulation is their friend. It will make us safer and better. And actually, the financial services markets prior to the crash were very, very, very heavily regulated. Some of the most more heavily regulated than the nuclear energy industry. Didn't stop the crash. So quantum of regulation is not your friend. Quality is more important than quantity. So we need to make that case now so that when we start rebalancing quantum of regulation for quality of regulation, we're not freaking everybody out. So I'm not going to get sucked in more detail than that, but we let the UK financial services sector die, and all the conversations about healthcare, about education, transport infrastructure, all that kind of stuff goes out the window because we won't have any money.
Daniel, I think you were next.
Thank you. It's really encouraging to hear you talk about the Conservative Party's history of standing up to vested interests in various areas and in the long run benefiting from that. On housing particularly, in terms of outcome, if you were to become Prime Minister and you got to implement all of the reforms to planning that you'd like, all of the reforms to regulations on builders, after 5 years, would you expect and would you hope that the average house price would be lower in real terms, higher in real terms, or about the same as currently?
Look, we've had a number of decades. We've probably had about 5 decades of residential price inflation completely outstripping every other form of inflation. And we're now staring down the barrel of a whole generation of people on really quite good salaries who have got almost no credible chance to get on the housing ladder. So the gorgeous Mrs. C sitting in the front row, the first house that we bought together was a 2-up, 2-down Victorian terrace house in Hither Green in southeast London. Not a particularly snazzy part of London. Lovely property, but not in a particularly snazzy part of London. That property now is probably, and I haven't checked very recently, it's probably knocking on £600,000. That is just nonsense. It is the kind of starter home that you'd expect someone moves out of a flat, you move into it, you maybe start a family, it's near a train station, you can get the train into London, but it's in the cheaper corner, one of the cheaper corners of London, £600,000, probably more than that. Now, if we allow the delta between average earnings and average house prices to continue to expand, then, as I say, what are young people going to do? They're just going to go somewhere else. And they're going to take their energy and their ideas with them. And then we are in all kinds of trouble. Now, I don't want to I don't want to turn around to homeowners and say I'm going to strip value from your house. I have no intention of doing that. But I think what we need to do is see that gulf between income and house prices closing gently over time. So in terms of, you use the word real terms. I think that's a sensible way of describing it. I think in real terms, the cost of housing has got to come back more into alignment with average incomes, because otherwise, as I say, we are just pricing talent out of the UK, and that's never a good idea.
All right. Matthew.
So first of all, thank you for coming to speak here today. You talked about the importance of the service sector and industries like tech. Do you think that, at least in the West, the tech sector needs more regulation? As if you look at what's happening in the US, there's calls for more regulation. In the European Union, they have their Digital Services Act. And over here, there was pretty much cross-party support for the Online Safety Bill and the Digital Markets Bill. So do you think that there are tech monopolies and they need to be tackled to help all of these small businesses, or that we've got the wrong approach on digital regulation?
Yeah. Well, look, as a rough rule of thumb, I've always said if you look at a sector and there's less than a dozen key players in that sector, that market is broken, and you need new entrants. You look at the tech sector. So I went to the United States of America. I was there for 3 days, and I visited all 3 days. I visited all the key players in the American tech sector in 3 days. That says to me there are not enough players in this market. And whenever you have not enough players in a market, you have suboptimal outcomes. Now, what the right answer to that is, again, my default setting, let's make sure there are new entrants in the market. Let's make sure there are people snapping at their heels. Let's make sure that the market is keeping itself honest. That is not always easy. And, the US had the antitrust laws when the oil barons created such a distorted market, when they were backward integrating, but they were basically just buying up the railway lines. They were buying up everything to protect their vested interests, and the US government took action and created a healthier market. I am uncomfortable with governments playing too heavily in the kind of free speech space, but I'm also uncomfortable with the rather laissez-faire attitude that some of the tech companies have had towards child sexual exploitation on their platforms, for example. And I said to them, and I won't say exactly who, but I said to a number of them, you seem very, very good at preventing bootleg Taylor Swift soundtracks on videos on your platforms, but you're also telling me that you are finding it very difficult to prevent images of children being abused from appearing on your platform. So which is it? Because you either control your platform or you don't. And my evidence base is that if I try and put a video of me dancing to an unlicensed Taylor Swift soundtrack, that video gets lifted. So help me out here. Do you want to sort your own act out, or do you want me to come after you? Just pick one. So I would rather, my default setting, I would rather the markets, I'd rather the players in the market step up to their responsibilities and do it. I also think that there is a place. I mean, I am a free marketeer. I don't believe in big government, but that's not the same as believing in no government. I like less regulation. That's not the same as saying I don't want no regulation. My preferred option is that the players in the market get their own house in order. But if they refuse to, then I think it is incumbent, particularly when you're looking at, exploitation, terrorism, criminality, there is a role for government to discharge its first duty, which is to protect the populace. And so, slightly long answer, but it is a complicated issue, and it goes to the heart of the balance between philosophy and pragmatism.
So I think before we all go and look for this video of James dancing to unlicensed Taylor Swift songs, we've got time for one more question. Who thinks they have the best unanswered question? Tim is very confident, so I'll give it to you, Tim.
I'm not confident it's the best. I have been encouraged by some of the things you've said. I'm delighted you're on Thatcherite and delighted you're thinking about getting rid of stamp duty, which I think would be a huge win all round. Bring prices down, get more mobility and so on. My question really is, how brave are you on tax? I happen to believe that we should try and continue the journey of bringing income tax rates down from the highest rate down from 45, aiming towards a rate of 33 or something like that, a much flatter tax rate system. I think we should be thinking of doing something about inheritance tax. Maybe not getting rid of it completely, but doing a lot. I think we should be thinking about going back to getting corporation tax rates down to 15% so that we can really compete. How brave are you in that area?
I think it's a great final question.
No, it's a cracking final question.
Easy one too, right?
Yeah, I could start by giving the very brave. But look, so we know there are certain key indicators. Forgive me, I'm going to meander a little bit, but I will promise you I'll come back on track. So when I was the Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, I had many of my interlocutors and contacts in the Arab world. And I was talking to the foreign minister of one of our close friends in the Arabian Peninsula, who said, and he was wearing a wonderful traditional Arab gown, and he said that at least once a week he wore Western clothes, because if he didn't put his jeans on once a week, it's very easy to lose track of how much weight you have put on. So he said wearing jeans was his way of knowing when he was getting too fat. It was a key indicator. I would suggest a key indicator of a Conservative government that allowed the tax burden to get too high, the equivalent of wearing jeans in the Arab Peninsula, is when the Labour Party criticise us for taxing too much, as they did going into the general election. Now, you and I both know that now they're in government, they'll put taxes up. But that's not the point. The point is they felt liberated criticising the Conservatives for having the tax burden set too high, which tells me we do need to bring taxes down. Now, you mentioned a number of taxes. I've given a couple of indicative taxes that I'd like to reduce or scrap and the reasons why. But going back to the kind of the philosophical underpinning of my thinking, I think we should reduce taxes on things that we want to encourage. So, the reason I said stamp duty, I want to encourage liquidity in the housing market. The reason I was a big fan of cutting national insurance contributions, twofold. It's a tax on work and working people, which we should try and drive down as much as possible. And also the other thing is a dishonest tax. It's an income tax. We didn't call it an income tax, but it was an income tax. So we should look to drive down taxes that disincentivize actions that we want to encourage. So we start off with things like that. That will give us an initial shopping list. But the bottom line is that you don't know you've taxed too far until after you've gone too far. We know we've gone too far. The British people have told us we've gone too far. The Labour Party told us we've gone too far. So let's start finding ways of reducing the tax burden. And the other thing that I've said, and goes to the point that you made about honesty and courage in politics. So we have to explain to the British people that if they want us to bring taxes down, and they've told us that they do want us to bring taxes down, we have to do less stuff. There are certain things that we have to do and do well. We have to protect people, which is why I'm committed to 3% of GDP on defence, because, we're spending just shy of 3%. No, we're spending just shy of 2.5% on defence. Ukraine is currently spending 34% of its GDP on defence. If you think spending on defence is expensive, wait till you spend money on war. So let's not go there. But we do need to push the tax burden down, but we do need to have that conversation with the British people ahead of time rather than just dumping on their laps and expecting them to be grateful, because that's not how it works.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking James Cleverly for being here with us tonight. And speaking so openly, James, thank you.